Part 6 of Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by PlutarchPerrin. Romulus, Part 3. The city thus doubled in its numbers. 100 of the Sabines were added by election to the Patricii, and the legions were enlarged to 6,000 footmen and 600 horsemen. The people too were arranged in 3 bodies, the first called Ramnenses, from Romulus, the second Thasienses, from Thasius, and the third Lucerenses, from the grove into which many betook themselves for refuge when a general asylum was offered, and then became citizens. Now the Roman word for grove is lusus. That these bodies were 3 in number, their very name testifies, for to this day they call them tribes, and their chief officers tribunes. And each tribe had 10 phratries or brotherhoods, which, as some say, were named after the 30 Sabine women, but this seems to be false, since many of them bear the names of places. However, they did make many other concessions to the women, to do them honor, some of which are as follow: to give them the right of way when walking, not to utter any indecent word in the presence of a woman, that no man should be seen naked by them, or else that he be liable to prosecution before the judges of homicide, and that their children should wear a sort of necklace, the bulla, so called from its shape, which was that of a bubble, and a robe bordered with purple. The 2 kings did not at once hold counsel in common with one another, but each at first sat with his own 100 counsellors apart. Then afterwards they united them all into one body, as at the present time. Thasius dwelt where now is the temple of Moneta, and Romulus beside the so-called steps of Fair Shore. These are near the descent into the Circus Maximus from the Palatine. There also, it is said, grew the sacred cornel tree, of which the following tale is told. Romulus once, in trial of his strength, cast thither from the Aventine hill a spear, the shaft of which was made of cornel wood. The head of the spear sank deep into the ground, and no one had strength to pull it up, though many tried, but the earth, which was fertile, cherished the wooden shaft, and sent up shoots from it, and produced a cornel trunk of good size. Those who came after Romulus preserved this with religious care as one of the most sacred objects, and walled it in. And if any visitor thought that it was not green nor flourishing, but likely to wither away and die, he immediately proclaimed it loudly to all he met, and these, as though helping to save a house on fire, would cry, "Water! Water!" and run together from all sides, carrying full buckets to the place. But when Caius Caesar, as they say, was repairing the steps about the enclosure, and the workmen dug here and there in the neighbourhood, the roots were inadvertently destroyed, and the tree withered away. The Sabines, then, adopted the Roman months, about which I have written sufficiently in my life of Numa. Romulus, on the other hand, made use of their oblong shields, and changed his own armour and that of the Romans, who before that carried round shields of the Argive pattern. Feasts and sacrifices they shared with one another, not discarding any which the 2 peoples had observed before, but instituting other new ones. One of these is the Matronalia, which was bestowed upon the women to commemorate their putting a stop to the war, and another is the Carmentalia. This Carmenta is thought by some to be a fate presiding over human birth, and for this reason she is honoured by mothers. Others, however, say that the wife of Evander the Arcadian, who was a prophetess and inspired to utter oracles in verse, was therefore surnamed Carmenta, since Carmina is their word for verses, her own proper name being Nicostrati. As to her own name there is general agreement, but some more probably interpret Carmenta as meaning bereft of mind, because of her ecstasies under inspiration, since carere is the Roman word for to be bereft, and mens for mind. Of the Perilia I have spoken before. As for the Lupercalia, judging by the time of its celebration, it would seem to be a feast of purification, for it is observed on the inauspicious days of the month of February, which name can be interpreted to mean purification, and the very day of the feast was anciently called Febrata. But the name of the festival has the meaning of the Greek Lykia, or Feast of Wolves, which makes it seem of great antiquity, and derived from the Arcadians in the following of Evander. Indeed, this meaning of the name is commonly accepted, for it can be connected with the she-wolf of the story. And besides, we see that the Luperci begin their course around the city at that point where Romulus is said to have been exposed. However, the actual ceremonies of the festival are such that the reason for the name is hard to guess. For the priests slaughter goats, and then, after 2 youths of noble birth have been brought to them, some of them touch their foreheads with a bloody knife, and others wipe the stain off at once with wool dipped in milk. The youths must laugh after their foreheads are wiped. After this they cut the goats' skins into strips and run about, with nothing on but a girdle, striking all who meet them with the thongs, and young married women do not try to avoid their blows, fancying that they promote conception and easy childbirth. A peculiarity of the festival is that the Luperci sacrifice a dog also. A certain Butus, who wrote fabulous explanations of Roman customs in elegiac verse, says that Romulus and Remus, after their victory over Amulius, ran exultantly to the spot where, when they were babes, the she-wolf gave them suck, and that the festival was conducted in imitation of this action, and that the 2 youths of noble birth run, quote, "smiting all those whom they meet as once with brandished weapons down from Alba's heights Remus and Romulus ran," and that the bloody sword is applied to their foreheads as a symbol of the peril and slaughter of that day, while the cleansing of their foreheads with milk is in remembrance of the nourishment which the babes received. But Caius Acilius writes that before the founding of the city Romulus and his brother once lost their flocks, and after praying to Faunus ran forth in quest of them naked, that they might not be impeded by sweat, and that this is the reason why the Luperci run about naked. If the sacrifice is a purification, one might say that the dog is sacrificed as being a suitable victim for such rites, since the Greeks, in their rites of purification, carry forth puppies for burial, and in many places make use of the rites called pyriskulakismoi. And if these rites are performed in grateful remembrance of the she-wolf that nourished and preserved Romulus, it is not without reason that the dog is slain, since it is an enemy to wolves, unless, indeed, the animal is thus punished for annoying the Luperci when they run about. It is said also that Romulus first introduced the consecration of fire, and appointed holy virgins to guard it, called Vestals. Others attribute this institution to Numa, although admitting that Romulus was in other ways eminently religious, and they say further that he was a diviner, and carried for purposes of divination the so-called litus, a crooked staff with which those who take auguries from the flight of birds mark out the regions of the heavens. This staff, which was carefully preserved on the Palatine, is said to have disappeared when the city was taken at the time of the Gallic invasion. Afterwards, however, when the barbarians had been expelled, it was found under deep ashes, unharmed by the fire, although everything about it was completely destroyed. He also enacted certain laws, and among them one of severity, which forbids a wife to leave her husband, but permits a husband to put away his wife for using poisons, for substituting children, and for adultery. But if a man for any other reason sends his wife away, the law prescribes that half his substance shall belong to his wife, and the other half be consecrated to Ceres. And whosoever puts away his wife shall make a sacrifice to the gods of the lower world. It is also a peculiar thing that Romulus ordained no penalty for parricides, but called all murder parricide, looking upon one as abominable and upon the other as impossible. And for many ages his judgment of such a crime seemed to have been right, for no one did any such deed at Rome for almost 600 years. But after the war with Hannibal, Lucius Hostius is reported to have been the first parricide. So much then may suffice concerning these matters. In the 5th year of the reign of Tatius, some retainers and kinsmen of his, falling in with ambassadors from Laurentum on their way to Rome, attempted to rob them of their money, and when they would not stand and deliver, slew them. It was a bold and dreadful crime, and Romulus thought its perpetrators ought to be punished at once. But Tatius tried to put off and turn aside the course of justice. This was the sole occasion of open variance between them. In all other matters they acted in the utmost concert and administered affairs with unanimity. The friends of the slain ambassadors, shut out as they were from all lawful redress through the efforts of Tatius, fell upon him as he was sacrificing with Romulus at Lavinium and killed him, but escorted Romulus on his way with loud praises of his justice. Romulus brought the body of Tatius home and gave it honourable burial, and it lies near the so-called Armilustrium on the Aventine hill, but he took no steps whatsoever to bring his murderers to justice. And some historians write that the city of Laurentum, in terror, delivered up the murderers of Tatius, but that Romulus let them go, saying that murder had been requited with murder. This led some to say and suspect that he was glad to be rid of his colleague, but it caused no disturbance in the government, nor did it lead the Sabines into faction, nay, some through the good will they had for him, others through their fear of his power, and others because they regarded him as a benevolent god, all continued to hold him in reverence to the end. Romulus was held in reverence also by many foreign peoples, and the earlier Latins sent ambassadors and established friendship and alliance with him. Fidenae, a neighbouring city to Rome, he took, as some say, by sending his horsemen of a sudden with orders to cut away the pivots of the gates, and then appearing himself unexpectedly. But others say that the men of Fidenae first made an incursion, driving off booty and devastating the territory and outskirts of the city, and that Romulus set an ambush for them, killed many of them, and took their city. He did not, however, destroy or raze it to the ground, but made it a colony of Rome, and sent thither 2500 colonists on the Ides of April. After this a plague fell upon the land, bringing sudden death without previous sickness upon the people, and afflicting the crops with unfruitfulness and the cattle with barrenness. There was a rain of blood also in the city, so that many superstitious fears were added to their unavoidable sufferings. And when similar calamities visited the people of Laurentum, all agreed at once that it was the miscarriage of justice for the death of Tatius and the slain ambassadors which brought the wrath of heaven down upon both cities. The murderers, therefore, were delivered up on both sides and punished, and the mischief visibly abated. Romulus also purified the cities with lustral rites, which they say are celebrated to this day at the Carentine Gate. But before the pestilence had ceased, the people of Cameria attacked the Romans and overran their territory, thinking them incapable of defending themselves by reason of their distress. Romulus therefore at once marched against them, overcame them in battle, and killed 6000 of them. He also took their city, transplanted half of the survivors to Rome, and sent to Cameria as colonists from Rome twice the number he had left there, and this on the 1st of August. So many citizens had he to spare after dwelling in Rome less than 16 years. Among other spoils he brought also a bronze 4-horsed chariot from Cameria, and dedicated it in the temple of Vulcan. For it he had a statue made of himself, with a figure of victory crowning him. The Roman state thus gathering strength, its weaker neighbours submitted to it, and were satisfied to be let alone. But the powerful ones, out of fear and jealousy, thought they ought not to tolerate, but resist and check the growing power of Romulus. And of the Tuscans, the people of Veii, who possessed much territory and dwelt in a great city, were the first to begin war with a demand for Fidenae, which they said belonged to them. Now this was not only unjust, it was actually ridiculous, that they, who had not come to the aid of the people of Fidenae when they were in the perils of war, but suffered them to perish, then demanded their houses and land from those who had come into possession of them. Accordingly Romulus gave them contemptuous answers, upon which they divided themselves into 2 armies, attacked Fidenae with one, and confronted Romulus with the other. Before Fidenae, then, they overpowered 2000 Romans and slew them, but they were defeated by Romulus with a loss of 8000 men. Once more a battle was fought near Fidenae, and here all agree that the victory was chiefly due to Romulus himself, who displayed every possible combination of skill and bravery, and seemed endowed with strength and swiftness far beyond the lot of man. But there is a statement made by some writers which is altogether fabulous, nay, rather wholly incredible, namely, that of the 14,000 Tuscans who fell in this battle, more than half were slain by Romulus with his own hand. For even the Messenians seem to have been boastfully extravagant in saying that Aristomenes thrice offered sacrifice for 100 Lacedaemonian enemies slain. After the rout of the enemy, Romulus suffered the survivors to escape, and moved upon their city itself. But they could not hold out after so great a reverse, and suing for peace, made a treaty of friendship for 100 years, giving up a large portion of their territory, called Septempegium, or the 7 districts, abandoning their salt works along the river, and delivering up 50 of their chief men as hostages. Romulus also celebrated a triumph for this victory on the Ides of October, having in his train, besides many other captives, the leader of the Veientes, an elderly man, who seems to have conducted the campaign unwisely, and without the experience to be expected of his years. Wherefore to this very day, in offering a sacrifice for victory, they lead an old man through the forum to the Capitol, wearing a boy's toga with a bulla attached to it, while the herald cries, "Sardines for sale!" For the Tuscans are said to be colonists from Sardis, and Veii is a Tuscan city. This was the last war waged by Romulus. Afterwards, like many, nay, like almost all men who have been lifted by great and unexpected strokes of good fortune to power and dignity, even he was emboldened by his achievement to take on a haughtier bearing, to renounce his popular ways, and to change to the ways of a monarch, which were made hateful and vexatious first by the state which he assumed. For he dressed in a scarlet tunic, and wore over it a toga bordered with purple, and sat on a recumbent throne when he gave audience. And he had always about him some young men called celeres from their swiftness in doing service. Others, too, went before him with staves, keeping off the populace, and they were girt with thongs, with which to bind at once those whom he ordered to be bound. To bind, in the Latin language, was formerly ligere, though now it is alligere, whence the wand-bearers are called lictores, and the wands themselves bacula, from the use, in the time of Romulus, of bacteriae, which is the Greek word for staves. But it is likely that the c in the word lictores, as now used, has been added, and that the word was formerly litores, which is the Greek liturgoi, meaning public servants. For the Greeks still call a public hall leiton, and the people laos. But when his grandfather Numitor died in Alba, and its throne devolved upon Romulus, he courted the favor of the people by putting the government in their hands, and appointed an annual ruler for the Albans. In this way he taught the influential man at Rome also to seek after a form of government which was independent and without a king, where all in turn were subjects and rulers. For by this time not even the so-called patricians had any share in the administration of affairs, but a name and garb of honor was all that was left them, and they assembled in their council chamber more from custom than for giving advice. Once there, they listened in silence to the commands of the king, and went away with this advantage only over the multitude, that they learned earlier what he had decreed. The rest of his proceedings were of lesser importance, but when of his own motion merely he divided the territory acquired in war among his soldiers, and gave back their hostages to the Veientes, without the consent or wish of the patricians, he was thought to be insulting their senate outright. Wherefore suspicion and calumny fell upon that body when he disappeared unaccountably a short time after. He disappeared on the nones of July, as they now call the month, then Quintilis, leaving no certain account, nor even any generally accepted tradition of his death, aside from the date of it, which I have just given. For on that day many ceremonies are still performed, which bear a likeness to what then came to pass. Nor need we wonder at this uncertainty, since, although Scipio Africanus died at home after dinner, there is no convincing proof of the manner of his end, but some say that he passed away naturally, being of a sickly habit, some that he died of poison administered by his own hand, and some that his enemies broke into his house at night and smothered him. And yet Scipio's dead body lay exposed for all to see, and all who beheld it formed therefrom some suspicion and conjecture of what had happened to it. Whereas Romulus disappeared suddenly, and no portion of his body or fragment of his clothing remained to be seen. But some conjectured that the senators, convened in the temple of Vulcan, fell upon him and slew him, then cut his body in pieces, put each a portion into the folds of his robe, and so carried it away. Others think that it was neither in the temple of Vulcan nor when the senators alone were present that he disappeared, but that he was holding an assembly of the people outside the city near the so-called Goat's Marsh, when suddenly strange and unaccountable disorders with incredible changes filled the air. The light of the sun failed, and night came down upon them, not with peace and quiet, but with awful peals of thunder and furious blasts, driving rain from every quarter, during which the multitude dispersed and fled, but the nobles gathered closely together. And when the storm had ceased and the sun shone out, and the multitude now gathered together again in the same place as before, anxiously sought for their king, the nobles would not suffer them to inquire into his disappearance, nor busy themselves about it, but exhorted them all to honor and revere Romulus, since he had been caught up into heaven, and was to be a benevolent god for them instead of a good king. The multitude, accordingly, believing this and rejoicing in it, went away to worship him with good hopes of his favor. But there were some, it is said, who tested the matter in a bitter and hostile spirit, and confounded the patricians with the accusation of imposing a silly tale upon the people, and of being themselves the murderers of the king. At this pass, then, it is said that one of the patricians, a man of noblest birth, and of the most reputable character, a trusted and intimate friend also of Romulus himself, and one of the colonists from Alba, Julius Proculus by name, went into the forum and solemnly swore by the most sacred emblems before all the people that, as he was travelling on the road, he had seen Romulus coming to meet him, fair and stately to the eye as never before, and arrayed in bright and shining armour. He himself then, affrighted at the sight, had said, "O king, what possessed thee, or what purpose hadst thou, that thou hast left us patricians a prey to unjust and wicked accusations, and the whole city sorrowing without end at the loss of its father?" Whereupon Romulus had replied, "It was the pleasure of the gods, O Proculus, from whom I came, that I should be with mankind only a short time, and that after founding a city destined to be the greatest on earth, for empire and glory, I should dwell again in heaven. So farewell, and tell the Romans that if they practice self-restraint and add to it valor, they will reach the utmost heights of human power. And I will be your propitious deity, Quirinus." These things seemed to the Romans worthy of belief, from the character of the man who related them, and from the oath which he had taken. Moreover, some influence from heaven also, akin to inspiration, laid hold upon their emotions, for no man contradicted Proculus, but all put aside suspicion and calumny, and prayed to Quirinus, and honoured him as a god. Now this is like the fables which the Greeks tell about Aristeas of Proconnesus and Cleomedes of Astypalaea. For they say that Aristeas died in a fuller's shop, and that when his friends came to fetch away his body it had vanished out of sight, and presently certain travellers returning from abroad said they had met Aristeas journeying towards Croton. Cleomedes also, who was of gigantic strength and stature, of uncontrolled temper, and like a madman, is said to have done many deeds of violence, and finally, in a school for boys, he smote with his fist the pillar which supported the roof, broke it in two, and brought down the house. The boys were killed, and Cleomedes, being pursued, took refuge in a great chest, closed the lid down, and held it so fast that many men with their united strength could not pull it up. But when they broke the chest to pieces, the man was not to be found, alive or dead. In their dismay, then, they sent messengers to consult the oracle at Delphi, and the Pythian priestess gave them this answer: "Last of the heroes he, Cleomedes, Astypalaean." It is said also that the body of Alcmene disappeared, as they were carrying her forth for burial, and a stone was seen lying on the bier instead. In short, many such fables are told by writers who improbably ascribe divinity to the mortal features in human nature as well as to the divine. At any rate, to reject entirely the divinity of human virtue were impious and base, but to mix heaven with earth is foolish. Let us therefore take the safe course and grant, with Pindar, that "our bodies all must follow death's supreme behest, but something living still survives, an image of life, for this alone comes from the gods." Yes, it comes from them, and to them it returns, not with its body, but only when it is most completely separated and set free from the body, and becomes altogether pure, fleshless, and undefiled. For a dry soul is best, according to Heracleitus, and it flies from the body as lightning flashes from a cloud. But the soul which is contaminated with body and surfeited with body, like a damp and heavy exhalation, is slow to release itself and slow to rise towards its source. We must not, therefore, violate nature by sending the bodies of good men with their souls to heaven, but implicitly believe that their virtues and their souls, in accordance with nature and divine justice, ascend from men to heroes, from heroes to demigods, and from demigods, after they have been made pure and holy, as in the final rites of initiation, and have freed themselves from mortality and sense, to gods, not by civic law, but in very truth and according to right reason, thus achieving the fairest and most blessed consummation. To the surname of Quirinus bestowed on Romulus, some give the meaning of Mars, others that of citizen, because the citizens were called Quirites, but others say that the ancients called the spearhead, or the whole spear, Quiris, and gave the epithet Quiritis to the Juno whose statue leans upon a spear, and the name Mars to a spear consecrated in the Regia, and the spear as a prize to those who performed great exploits in war, and that Romulus was therefore called Quirinus as a martial or spear-wielding god. However that may be, a temple in his honor is built on the hill called Quirinalis after him, and the day on which he vanished is called People's Flight, and Capertine Nones, because they go out of the city and sacrifice to the goat's marsh, and Capra is their word for she-goat. And as they go forth to the sacrifice, they shout out many local names like Marcus, Lucius, and Caius, in imitation of the way in which, on the day when Romulus disappeared, they called upon one another in fear and confusion. Some, however, say that this imitation is not one of flight, but of haste and eagerness, and explain it as referring to the following occasion. After the Gauls had captured Rome and been driven out by Camillus, and when the city was still too weak to recover itself readily, an expedition was made against it by many of the Latins, under the command of Livius Postumius. This general stationed his army not far from Rome, and sent the herald with the message that the Latins wished to renew their ancient relationship and affinity with the Romans, by fresh intermarriages between the two peoples. If, therefore, the Romans would send them a goodly number of virgins and their widows, they should have peace and friendship, such as they had formerly made with the Sabines on the like terms. On hearing this message, the Romans hesitated between going to war, which they feared, and the surrender of their women, which they thought no more desirable than to have them captured. But while they were in this perplexity, a serving-maid called Philotis, or, as some say, Tutela, advised them to do neither, but by the use of a stratagem to escape alike the war and the giving of hostages. Now the stratagem was this, that they should send to the enemy Philotis herself, and with her other comely serving-maids arrayed like free-born women. Then in the night Philotis was to display a signal fire, at which the Romans were to come in arms and deal with their enemies while asleep. This was done, with the approval of the Latins, and Philotis displayed the signal fire from a certain wild fig tree, screening it behind with coverlets and draperies, so that its light was unseen by the enemy, but visible to the Romans. When accordingly they beheld it, they sallied forth at once in great haste, and because of their haste calling upon one another many times at the gates. They fell upon their enemies when they least expected it, and mastered them, and now celebrate this festival in memory of their victory. And the nones on which it falls are called Capertine from the wild fig tree, the Roman name for which is Caprificus, and they feast the women outside the city in booths made of fig tree boughs. Then the serving-maids run about in companies and play, after which they strike and throw stones at one another, in token that on that earlier day they assisted the Romans and shared with them in their battle. These details are accepted by many historians, but their calling out one another's names in the daytime and their marching out to the goat's marsh as for sacrifice seem to be more consonant with the former story, unless, to be sure, both actions happened to take place on the same day in different periods. Romulus is said to have been 54 years of age, and in the 38th year of his reign, when he disappeared from among men. End of Romulus, Part 3.